Dora, you're going to tell us a little bit about the program in a second, introduce this incredible lineup of speakers we have. We're really grateful for everyone for joining us. You know, this is co-sponsored by the Anti-Racist Teaching and Learning Collective, and we always say, you know, we're all teachers and we're all learners. So I'm wondering, Dora, like, what are you looking forward to learning tonight from this great panel?
It's a really good question. I think I'm interested in hearing about the variety of entry points for both students and teachers in learning about Asian American studies, since we have such a diverse panel of community members in the classroom, to see what we can each do in this work.
Great, thank you, Dora, thank you. And thank you for agreeing to co-moderate, I appreciate it. Did you just introduce yourself quickly and tell us your hometown to remind us?
Sure, my name's Dora. I am a second year at Yale University. I am studying ethnicity, race, and migration, and my hometown is Vernon Hills, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago.
Great. All right. Welcome. That's awesome. All right. But Dora, you know, like part of this co-host thing, right? We got to start off with the quiz. You know this, right?
Yes.
You do know this, and you're ready for the quiz?
Ready.
Okay. All right. TZB, are we ready for the poll? But you're a little nervous, aren't you, Dora, about what the first question is going to be?
Always before quizzes.
Yeah, it's a quiz. Okay. So here we go. All right. Here's the first question. All right. Kamai Health Advocates is based in which US city, Dora? Is it A, Long Beach, California, B, West Hartford, Connecticut, C, Lowell, Massachusetts, or D, Minneapolis, Minnesota? This is going to get us going, Dora. So first we're going to give everyone a chance to cast their vote. Use the poll here, weigh in, help Dora out. I mean, this one can't be too hard, Dora. We're going to close it in a second. All right. Okay. All right. You know, I'm going to hear from you first, Dora. So you're not going to get like the phone, you know, like the help from home. So Dora, what do you think the answer is here? I
think Minneapolis, but I'm not sure.
Minneapolis. Okay. All right. That's totally. Oh, look. Yeah, flight preference for West Hartford, and Dora, the people were right. Okay. It is West Hartford. And part of the reason this is important for our webinar tonight is that the long tradition, as we'll hear about from our panelists, that Asian American Studies is always in collaboration with community-based organizations. And this is an organization that's been around for decades, has long histories of resilience, of thinking about wellness and health, responses to trauma. These are long-standing issues. And we're always, while we think about forms of discrimination and domination, we also think about all these forms of futurity and strength and community formation. And it's a great example. And indeed, in all these cities, organizations serving Cambodia and Southeast Asians, the broad diversity of Asian Americans are always a part of our thinking. All right, Dora, we just have two more, okay?
Yeah.
All right, here we go. All right, so this is a question about a Kanaka Maoli Native Hawaiian-led struggle that has recently drawn international attention. So which struggle is this? Is it A, stopping the construction of a telescope on the Big Island, B, closing military bases in Kauai, C, protesting gentrification in Honolulu, or D, restoring Native Hawaiian language classes in school? Which struggle has drawn international attention, people from all over the world? Folks, cast your vote. These are not easy, Dora, I know. I know they're not easy.
I'm struggling.
I should have given you a heads up before, huh? That would have been better. All right, what do you have for us?
I'm going to guess stopping construction of a telescope on the Big Island.
Yes, that's exactly right. Thank you. And this is just a really important reminder of, we're going to talk about distinctions between, and folks are right there with you, when we talk about Asian American communities and Pacific Islander communities and why they're sometimes attached and the distinctions, but also those long histories of social movements which are key to Asian American studies. And indeed, all of these issues around military bases, gentrification, Hawaiian language, those have all been part of Native Hawaiian social movements and have really, really important legacies and insights for many, many people. So it's a rich genealogy. Okay, Dora, we're at number 3, right? This is it. This is it.
Here we go.
But Dora, this is the hardest one, all right? I'm sorry I hate to do this. All right. So this is a wonderful novel called The Pagoda. It's a historical novel about a Chinese migrant shopkeeper. And here is the question. Where is it based in? San Francisco, Jamaica, in the Caribbean, New York, or Mexicali, Mexico? This is not easy, Dora. It's just a wonderful novel. It's a novel. It's a great novel to teach with. I want to think about teaching Asian American Studies and literature classes. At some point, Dora, we got to go for it. So folks, get in your choices and go for it, Dora.
My guess is Mexico, D.
Mexico. Okay. Jason, I know you have, Professor Chang, some, empathy, sympathy connection to that answer because, as we'll hear, Jason wrote a book about Chinese in Mexico. But the answer is Jamaica. And part of what I want to just say that is we're going to get to think and to be in conversation with both Lisa Lowe and Jason Chang, who have these really broad understandings of Asian migration, life, community formation, including the representation of Chinese and other Asians in the Caribbean, in South America, long legacies of colonialism, et cetera. And this is a wonderful novel that deals with questions of gender and longing and diaspora as well. So this is a great theme for us to take up as well, okay? Dora, thank you for getting us started. I'm going to turn over to you to just give us a heads up on who we're going to hear from now.
Our panelists today are going to be Professor Lisa Lowe from Yale University, Professor Jason Chang from the University of Connecticut, a teacher, an ethnic studies instructor and coach from the Boston Public Schools, Katie Lee, and another teacher, Allison Norrie, from Warde High School in Fairfield. We have 2 students with us on the panel tonight as well, Joyce Fang and Jaime Kim from Farmington High School and East Lyme High School, respectively. And the co-moderators are me and Professor Hosang.
Great, thank you, Dora. So exciting. We're having, discussions, teachers, teacher educators, students, and just a very quick shout out, Anti-Racist Teaching and Learning Collective, Yale Education Studies, Yale RITM Center, Public Humanities, the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies, the UConn Asian American Studies Institute, all collaborated to bring these great folks together. Dora, over to you for the first question for Professors Lowe and Chang.
Welcome, Professor Lowe and Chang. So both of you bring a long history of teaching and writing about Asian American studies. So let's start tonight with just some of the basics. Who are Asian Americans in the United States, and also more specifically in Connecticut?
Wow, thank you everyone. Dora and Dan, thank you so much for the introduction and this amazing webinar series. So glad to be able to contribute. Yeah, so one of the things that has underscored recent attention to Asian Americans is that we recognize many people may not be familiar with kind of basic terms or demographic understanding of who Asian Americans are. And so, now it's really common to just, it's really common to just say like AAPI without kind of really understanding what's included in that. And that term, it came out through, the combination of Asian American and Pacific Islander. And, our conversation today is really going to focus on Asian Americans. But we are dedicating a specific program to this later on in the month, to Pacific Islanders, to really understanding what is included in Pacific Islander studies, how it's really distinctive. So I had this really awesome interactive map that I wanted to share with everyone that showed like, a clickable kind of, dimensions where you could show where, like I mapped out the census population for Asian Americans in the state, but as luck would have it, the server is down today. So instead I have a picture of the map. So I'm going to try and share that real quick and just talk about some of the features here. All right, is that visible? Yeah, awesome. Okay, great. So, so here, this is a map that shows 2017 census data for Asian Americans in the state of Connecticut. And it includes about 24, 24 ethnicities or self-identified country of origin for folks. And we can see that there are Asian Americans in every corner of the state, some more than others, but all across Connecticut. And if this were live on the server, I'd be able to float over the pie diagrams and be able to show you the ethnicities. But really, I wanted to point out that the biggest ethnicities represented in the state are from India, or countries of origin are from India, China, and Vietnam. Those are the three largest groups. But one of the things that we also learned by looking at census data is that the Asian American population of Connecticut has about doubled since 2000, right? So this is, while many communities in Connecticut are showing population decline, Asian Americans are really increasing their presence in Connecticut, and in many diverse ways. So so in this map, the light blue shows India, the mustardy color there shows China, and the dark blue is Vietnam. And so, one of the things that's interesting about this is that it can also be kind of misleading to just lead with these kinds of features, because these countries of origin don't really capture some of the religious and ethnic minorities within those countries. For instance, we really want to pay attention to, say, like the Sikh community that is in India, but is a religious, a community that is a part of Connecticut that really has their own distinctive identity. And then also that this also doesn't really tell us much about the status of these folks, because what we learned with Southeast Asians is that many came in the 60s, 70s, and 80s as refugees, right? And so like the excellent question about Khmer health advocates, these are communities that have become a part of Connecticut, and most notably with the recent rise of Ocean Vuong as the writer Ocean Vuong, who settled in Hartford, and so one of the things that we really is important about understanding this kind of diversity is there are really lots of different kinds of needs for these communities. I wrote a piece earlier during the pandemic about the need for language access for Southeast Asians, and that really is a part of healthcare access, is language access. And so these are some of the things that I think are important to demonstrate about the diversity of Asian Americans in Connecticut. But we look at this information, and we also have to understand that the term Asian American grew out of political identification of resistance to the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s, and it reflected like a commitment to anti-racism, and thus became a pan-ethnicity, right? So that term came out of this kind of community awareness. However, not all people with Asian heritage in the US consider themselves Asian American. Recent immigrants may not call themselves Asian Americans, right? So the term Asian American is more a starting point, a place to build connections to your community. And hopefully the term becomes filled with the meaning, with meaning as people see it represents their shared interests and a shared struggle. So that's really one of the points that I wanted to demonstrate with the community dialogue on May 19th, to kind of model what those kinds of conversations to build meaning behind the term Asian American could mean. So, so what's important is to open channels for communication that demonstrate your interest in knowing about their stories and preferences. But despite all these differences, Asian American studies coheres around the themes of migration, racism, experiences with war. And Lisa, you are one of our field's most distinguished scholars. How have you thought about the core historical narratives of our field. How would
Well,
you share that?
Thanks, Jason. I really agree with you that there are so many different national origin groups and histories of immigration. It can be a big challenge to teach Asian American studies for the first time. And people who teach the field are very alert to how Chinese, Japanese, South Asians, and Koreans first came to the US for nearly a century without being able to be naturalized as citizens. And in a sense, were kind of the first undocumented racialized labor pool that, you know, built the railroads, worked in mining, worked in agriculture. And then each group was subject to immigration exclusion on top of being barred from citizenship as aliens ineligible to citizenship. So, you know, and then the Philippines, of course, were colonized by the US. So Asian Americans have been, even before the Asian American movement of the 1960s and 70s, really have this long history in the United States that many people aren't aware of. I was really, you know, shocked when I moved to the East Coast, because there's so many more Asian Americans on the West Coast, how the general population in the Northeast is not aware of that long history, unless they're from New York City, for example. And as you say, you know, so much of Asian American history is affected by US wars in Asia throughout the 20th century, in the Philippines at the turn of the century, in the Spanish-American War, with Japan during World War II, in Korea, and in Vietnam. So this is so much of the background that contributes to this stereotype of Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners, as not belonging, as un-American, as racial enemies at war. So those are some of the things that I often teach in my courses. But also, you know, I think, as you say, Asian American studies came out of social movements, and I think that there are several different ways in which we might teach it. On the one hand, we could teach it as a kind of separate field of these different national origin groups, but I also think, you know, teaching it within an ethnic studies framework in relationship to other racialized groups like African Americans, Latinx, or indigenous peoples is another way to teach it, or to teach it in terms of comparative colonialisms or a third worldist frame, where we see the US empire and British Empire in Asia and see Asian decolonizing peoples as part of a larger set of decolonizing movements. But how do you teach your intro to Asian American studies? I know that your research is on Chinese immigration to Mexico. So do you teach Asian immigration to the US, or do you teach it to the Americas more broadly?
Yeah, I love that question. You know, one of the strengths of Asian American studies is that it centers the lives and experiences of Asians in diaspora. And through the shift in orientation, you know, we don't fall into the typical kind of, you know, mythology of American history, which you have foreigners that arrive and assimilate, become citizens, and end of story. You know, and so, you know, one of the things I did with my research in Mexico was I tried to say, well, okay, what does the Asian American Studies project look like in another country? What's sort of portable about what we do in the field? And you know, it's really about the function of racism in society. How does it help to, you know, how does racial difference, you know, generate certain conditions for power? And so, you know, as you've shown, Asian Americans have been excluded from that process of becoming kind of that, you know, fulfilling that kind of American narrative of integration, and following that norm. So without the loose, you know, without those boundary markers, I like to begin the conversation about Asian American history with the development of the coolie trade, or the system of indenture that emerged in the first half of the 1800s. And this is a system that recruited and distributed Chinese and South Asian contract workers, or coolies, and they were thought of as suitable replacements for enslaved labor as the Atlantic slave trade was being dismantled. And so while the indenture system claimed that the legacy of consent through the labor contract, these formalities really just concealed the brutal and deadly nature of trafficking workers to dangerous sites like the Guano Islands of Peru or the exploitation in Cuba's sugarcane plantations. And so it's like the same reckless and cruel disregard for human life that characterized the Atlantic slave trade was also common in the Pacific coolie trade. Because of this practice, really the perceptions of Asian immigration were fused with notions of cheap, free, and foreign and expendable labor. And it was also at that time that President Lincoln passed the anti-coolie legislation in 1862, which codified this racist idea about Asians, even as it condemned any form of unfree labor, as would be declared in the Emancipation Proclamation the following year. So
that novel that Dan was just showing, The Pagoda, would be a wonderful way to bring that into the classroom. I often use novels in my teaching, but what kinds of materials do you use in your classes?
Yeah, I even though I'm a historian, I still really love the interdisciplinary nature of Asian American studies, and and I think that really
like art or visual culture, is that something?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really allows for a lot of different entry points in the K through 12 curriculum to integrate art and literature, and so one of the things that is interesting about where art fits into Asian American studies is it was a part of the formation of the political movement too, because art and the visual arts were, provided a means to express a cultural and political aspirations for liberation and justice that didn't quite exist yet. And so it was also a really powerful cultural expression of Asian American identity that's informed by trauma and silence, but also by like joy and celebration. And so looking at art, sometimes allows people to put things into words that maybe they haven't been able to express before. And so that's, one of the things that I love about, the interdisciplinary part of our field. But how about you as a literature scholar? You also, you incorporate literature and poetry?
I do. I mean, I often use novels and poetry, but what it strikes, I know we're running out of time, but what strikes me is that the demographic map that you showed was so illustrative of the population, but through novels and through art, we actually get pictures of people. And I think that's really so wonderful for the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is just so helpful, and thank you so much for this opening exchange. I know, Jason, we wanted to make sure you had a little bit of time to talk about a piece of legislation that's making its way through that might give us some more openings about teaching Asian American studies in Connecticut in particular. Not everyone here is from Connecticut. And then we're going to share a curriculum guide for teachers everywhere to draw from. But Jason, could you just talk to us about that bill for a sec?
Yeah, we're really excited. There's a bill, HB 6619, that we've been following, and it's set to create a model curriculum for Asian American and Pacific Islander studies, as well as Native American studies and LGBTQIA studies. It has a couple other pieces in the legislation, but we're really excited because it would be the first time that the state would have a model curriculum. And if that passes, we really is an invitation for communities to voice their opinions and to raise their to engage with their schools to say that this is something they want adopted. And we're really excited to support teachers in developing resources and having that having Asian American studies live in our communities, not just in the classroom.
Thanks so much, Jason and Lisa, for getting us started in that way. We're going to come back to you in a little bit, and also just to acknowledge, Jason, I know there's a lot of work, a lot of organizing work, advocacy, contact with legislatures, meetings that went into that process, and that it's just the beginning. So Dora, help us think about this curriculum guide now.
Absolutely. So TCV just pinned two lovely students, Isetso and Jason Lee, who have helped us compile a curriculum guide that the Anti-Racist Teaching and Learning Collective is providing for K through 12 educators. One of the biggest challenges about teaching Asian American studies and any other anti-racist framework is to find effective curriculum. And so this resource is supposed to help all the educators do so. Isa, Jason, if you want to speak more.
Yeah, totally. So we have two documents to show you guys today. This guide that Professor Hossein is currently showing is it's a guide that highlights some resources from like a larger database, like a larger spreadsheet that Jason will talk about later. But yeah, so for this one, if you want to scroll back up, actually, essentially we've compiled like 4 different types of resources. We have full curriculum units that are like multi-day units that tackle themes like immigration and like bring in just like, yeah, like questions of what does immigration mean, like who is allowed in, and like what are the politics around that, like across Asian American history, as well as how that connects to contemporary issues today with like dreamers and stuff. So there's like curriculum units that like are multi-day comprehensive, and then we also have standalone lesson plans if you only have like one day or like half a period that you want to like include something else in. Then we have like a category for just like shorter like bite-sized lesson plans that you can like bring in more easily. If you scroll down like one page, I just want to like show like one example. So on here, actually, is there a way to like zoom in? It's kind of small for me.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so just like as an example, like on this page, you can see we've highlighted something called the Asian American Education Project. Their series about Asian Americans has like each of these bullet points is like one section of that entire project, and each section focuses on one era of Asian American history. So this first one called Breaking Ground goes from like 1850s to 1920s and has 8 lesson plans. Yeah, so you can look at it like by era, and some of the lesson plans in there are like really like adaptable across sort of like subject areas. And then this particular project also has like free training, like free workshops for teachers that are like 1 hour and free, and generally is a really great resource. So this guide just sort of like shows different resources like that you can go and explore on your own, and we just sort of show the ones that we thought were like really detailed, fruitful, and like emphasize an anti-racist and like relational framework for thinking about Asian American studies instead of just like an isolated like here's one block of people to learn about. It's like these lesson plans and like resources show a way of like incorporating Asian American like analytics and frameworks and content into like a broad variety of subject areas and grade levels.
The tail end of our guide, if we scroll down a little bit to websites and multimedia, lists some helpful websites, multimedia, additional resources. These resources include databases, documentaries, even a video game lesson that we thought would be helpful for supplementing the curricula above by filling in content gaps, offering alternative teaching and learning resources, or connecting the content to broader political and organizing contexts. We also hope that this section of the guide would be particularly accessible for students who want to pursue their own independent learning. Resources such as the South Asian American Digital Archive, the Vietnamese American Oral History Project, and the Korean American Digital Archive, we hope will lend themselves particularly well to like this sort of student independent organization and education. All of these lesson plans, curriculum units, and resources come from our larger Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies database started by the Anti-Racist Teaching and Learning Collective earlier this spring. Where possible, lesson items have been matched to Common Core, ELA, and states' Department of Education standards so that teachers can easily slot in AAPI content into existing state and national learning standards and just their day-to-day lessons. And the spreadsheet is also searchable by keywords such as Transcontinental Railroad, Japanese internment, yellow peril, Filipino labor, as well as by grade level for teacher convenience. And the goal of the spreadsheet really is to centralize AAPI resources for teachers interested in incorporating AAPI content in their classrooms, as well as make visible the gaps in available resources, missing perspectives, and the work that still needs to be done. The balance of lessons in terms of content, grade level, or subject area is the result of our efforts to create an equitable array of curricula constrained by what's actually out there and what's been produced. This spreadsheet is an open and collaborative list. We hope you'll freely iterate upon it, and we encourage teachers, educators, and students to adapt the spreadsheet to their specific needs.
And if you have things that you want to add, please email me and Jason, and that will be dropped in the chat shortly. It's supposed to be like a collaborative ongoing project.
Ethan, Jason, thank you so much. It was an enormous amount of work to get this together to help teachers get connected to high quality curated lessons. So really, really grateful for it and for like such a clear explanation of it. So such a great resource. And this sets us up perfectly now to welcome Katie Lee and Allison Norrie, who are not just longtime teachers, but also have a deep body of experience in working with and supporting teachers and helping to think about how they shift their practice in the classroom. So I want to first start by welcoming Katie. Katie, you have a background in Asian American Studies as part of your undergraduate training. You have experience teaching in the San Francisco Bay Area as well. You've been involved in this fantastic project with the Boston Teachers Union to help advocate for Asian American Studies in Boston public schools, which is so innovative that teachers themselves, through their labor unions, are making this an important priority. I thought we could just start by asking you, Katie, a little bit to just share some examples of how you've taught Asian American Studies in the classroom, how you've brought it in, and the kind of advice you have for other teachers in doing this work.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me. So I am aware I am from Massachusetts, not from Connecticut. So I just thank you for inviting me into your state. I brought a few resources that I have, because I know when I go to these things, I always want to see books and I want to see resources. So one is an elementary resource. This is called Coolies by Yin. And how I've used this in the classroom is I actually teach high school. I teach L's in high school, English learners, but I use them. I've used this. I think the illustrations are really wonderful. So it starts, just to give you a sense, like it starts with the grandmother talking about sort of like to the younger person, like these are our ancestors, and this is like how I'm going to tell the story, right? And so the whole book has just really beautiful illustrations and allows for sort of like the story to be told. And the way that I've used it with L's is just showing them the pictures and having them talk through the pictures and at first, just to understand the full story even before diving into any of the text. So those are some of the ways I've used it. I also really, really, really love this book. It's Inside Out and Back Again. It's written in poetry prose. And so it's this beautifully written story about a girl who grew up and then lives through the Vietnam War and then migrates to the United States. But it kind of reads like A House on Mango Street if it was in poetry prose, if that makes sense. But it's really beautifully written, and it has like such, but it's also like very accessible for middle school grades, right? So it's a middle school book. And then another book I brought is They Call Us Enemy by George Takei. So this is a graphic novel, right? So like I think this is really a really fascinating way to teach like history or teach Asian American Studies is through the use, and young adults is through the use of graphic novels and comics, right? And so this one is specifically about if you're familiar with George Takei, that name, he plays Captain Sulu in Star Trek. Let me make sure I say the right Star Trek, not Star Wars, Star Trek. And he talks about his own family and sort of like his journey through, being incarcerated with his family during World War II. I also wanted to share one more resource, a couple more resources. One is that a really invaluable resources that I use in the classroom often is Ancestors in the Americas. It's a documentary that is available on Canopy for free if you have a library card. And so that was produced in the 90s independently by Lonnie Ding. And actually Jason shared with me that he is a student of Lonnie's, right? And so it makes total sense that he would start with the coolie trade, because that is that is what she starts with basically in her film. And so, why I want to highlight this is, even though it was done in the 90s, is actually really sharp analysis and narrative, and doesn't start, it talks about how the Asian American experience doesn't start when we step foot here, right? So like exactly what Jason and Lisa were talking about, that it really starts with US and European empire, right? So why are we here? It's because they were there, right? So remembering that, Columbus was actually trying to find Asia when he quote unquote discovered the new land, right? So like there was already a precedent of Europe going to Asia wanting our stuff, right? Like, so it was like in simple terms, that's sort of what was going on, right? And so without talking about sort of like the documentary really centers US and European empire, war, acquisition of our labor and resources, and colonizations of our lands as the real reasons why Asian Americans are really here in this country, right? In this land right now. And then those reasons actually continue today. So all you have to do is Google military bases in the world, and you will find US military bases all over our sending countries, as well as surrounding all of our sending countries, right? As a way of surveillance, right? And so for Asian Americans, as an Asian American teacher, I think it's so important to do like our own grounding, because growing up, I never learned about Asian American history, right? So it was really important for me to understand my own history, ground myself first before I do any sort of teaching around either the history or the racially lived experiences of Asian Americans today. And we just have to stop looking at ourselves like non-Asians look at us, right? And I think that Ancestors in the Americas is unapologetically from an Asian American standpoint. I will also contrast that with the documentary that is out right now, Asian Americans, PBS Asian Americans, and you're probably wondering like why I'm not featuring that, even though it's more current. And while some of the resources are useful, like Issa and Jason highlighted, right, that a lot of the narrative is actually, I found very problematic, right? And it's actually, when you compare it side to side with this other documentary that I'm talking about, it's actually very problematic because it has this theme of Asian Americans have arrived. And there are major themes of like meritocracy, buying into the American dream, individualism, supporting the model minority myth. There's actually a lot of the ways in which the story is told doesn't critique at all like capital or US empire. And so really, if you dig into the story and dig into that documentary more, the PBS Asian Americans, I want to do that because I think that do a quick critical thing of that, because I think as teachers of Asian American studies, we can't just take anything that has Asian American on it and say, let's teach that, right? Because we actually have to have a really critical eye when we're looking at curriculum. So they do a lot of this like featuring of good Americans, meaning good Americans that are trying to assimilate and trying to sort of be, never complain and forever grateful to the US and like to the United States and like really like have made it, right, kind of thing. And so in the film, they really do a lot of features on like merchants, on like entrepreneurs, cultural brokers, Asian Americans fought in the US military, basically essentially people who tried to assimilate as hard as they could, like the exceptional people, right? And individuals who succeeded against all odds despite being discriminated against, right? So if you compare that with the other documentary I was talking about, this one barely mentions laborers, even though they're a huge part of history. There are parts of it that I would take out and like use, right, in terms of history, but I think the narrative that strings it all together can be very problematic and really supports model minority myth instead of as if it were a real thing instead of deconstructing it, right? So I think that what a documentary should do, any Asian American documentary should do, is really ask why these images have been created for us and who has created those images for us and for what purpose, right? And that I feel like the first film I mentioned really talks about that versus the second one, right? So that's just wanting to sort of put in some critical thinking around all of that. And in terms of advice to teachers, I think there's 3 pieces of things that I've thought about really. First, I think in general, you just need to know how Asian Americans have been racialized and positioned if you're going to do any work around teaching Asian Americans first, right? So a lot of grounding first, because I think the dominant narrative about Asian Americans is strong and real around those controlling images around us, right? Who we, both, I think Lisa and Jason mentioned it around the model minority, around perpetual foreigner, enemy alien. Those are really strong controlling images of Asian Americans, and they're in everyone's minds, including Asian Americans, right? Like that's how literally we think of ourselves sometimes. And so one is that the American dream is a myth for Asian Americans, right? It's not really, the Asian American experience is not guided by success in the American dream. And if anything, it was just that, a dream, because it's never a reality. If you really look into Asian American history, our reality as Asian Americans in this country is that we're colonized, right? We were coerced, used for our labor, whether it being building railroads, supporting understaffed medical system, or writing computer code, right? We were lynched, we were beaten, we were blamed and scapegoated, excluded, surveilled, erased, run out, deported, incarcerated, and gaslighted, and this continues to today. Right? I want to make this clear. It's not of something of the past. There's a way we have to link the past with the present. It is how literally I got here, right? My body got here. So I think that even, like when I was, I'm not familiar with Connecticut's curriculum or standards or whatnot. So I started just looking into Asian American studies and saw that there was a bill, but there was another bill that had Black and Latinx studies had been passed already, right? So I think, like, again, like this idea that Asian Americans are not really ones that the United States has recognized or refuses to recognize is very much part of sort of understanding the Asian American experience. The second one is that the only way we've survived isn't by individual hard work or pulling up our bootstraps, but it's rather by taking care of each other. We've formed communities over when US society was hostile to us in the past and today. We formed our own communities, whether they be bachelor societies, mutual aid associations, family associations, benevolent societies, right? Cooperatives, rotating credit structures, lending circles. These are all examples of ways in which Asian Americans have formed community in order to take care of each other. Even today, you know, there are programs around in the Bay Area, they're doing programs around escorting elderly, right? Because they're afraid of elders being attacked on the street. They're doing distribution of collected funds, right? Mutual aid associations right now. So the third thing I want to say is that we're not quiet, right? If you ever walk into, it's not our culture to be quiet, actually. If you ever walked into a dim sum restaurant, you know what I'm talking about, right? My peoples are actually really freaking loud, right? In fact, it sounds like we're yelling all the time, and, you know, so it's not that we're quiet, right? If it's anything, if it's why we keep our heads low, it's not because we were complicit with white supremacy or, again, that it was our culture. It's because in many ways it was the only way to survive, right? It was a means for survival. We were socialized to be that way, in other words, right? So if we fought that individually, if we fight that back individually, in fact, we are often met with violence, right? But all you need to do is look at case law to understand, like, that we've never really been quiet. We've never been quiet. In fact, our tradition of activism, resistance, community building is uniquely Asian American in our own. And so we speak out and resist. It's collective and it's systematic, right? So think about birthright citizenship, bilingual education, school desegregation, anti-discrimination laws, DREAM Act. These are all just a few of the areas in which Asian Americans have had, like, enormous impact on the policies and laws in the United States. In fact, Asian American movement, when it was, I'm so glad that Jason spoke about that. The Asian American movement was a collective response for being systematically erased, right? It was a collective response. And the term Asian American, just like Jason said, it was a political term. It was a self-identified political term to unerase us, to make ourselves visible in the way that we wanted to be visible, right? Because it was a term that recognized our shared oppression, our racial positioning, and our political power, and at the same time, answer to the needs of their community. So just to end with saying that, you know, as a teacher, I think before you teach anything, you need a lot of grounding. And again, these controlling images of Asian Americans, we need to be able to recognize them in any curriculum that we put in front of us, because you actually can't begin to teach Asian America with those things in your head.
Thank you so much. I mean, you both gave us, like, all of these very specific, you know, text materials, but also this really compelling framework to think that it's not just about incorporation or visibility, but there's a politics to it. So grateful for that. We're also going to put into the chat a wonderful video, kind of a book, photo book that Katie has developed for kind of younger students, younger grade levels, that lifts up many of these issues. Or maybe, Katie, you can do it. I just want to, before I turn it back to Dora, turn quickly to Allison. So Allison, you're a longtime teacher in Connecticut. You've worked with the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies. Could you just share a little bit about, you know, we've seen these materials. Many teachers here have not had the benefit of these frameworks, these forms of education in their training. What advice do you have for them about beginning to incorporate and kind of take up some of these themes?
Yeah, and for the sake of time, I'll be brief, and I'll throw my email into the chat box too, so anybody who wants more community-based resources coming out of Connecticut can just reach out. But my biggest, you know, my two biggest things are, you know, the community, not just activism component, but the outreach. And so one of the biggest problems in incorporating, you know, any of these curricula has been, you know, bringing in parents, bringing in Board of Ed members, bringing in local council people to get them to have a buy-in. Now, I teach down in Fairfield County, and so demographically, it is simultaneously both very diverse, but also incredibly white. And so there's a lot of pressure to continue on with the monolithic version of a US history curriculum, and it becomes a, oh, okay, well, we'll just offer the African American or the Latinx or the API stuff as like an elective, right? And we'll put it in the course catalog. And if the students take it, they take it. And if they don't, it's okay because it's in the course catalog. So if anybody comes to spy on us or audit us, it looks like we're playing the part. And so then stuff gets swept under the rug. That's much easier, you know, to happen within the school district or within the school itself if parents, community partners, council people are not involved. So that's my biggest piece of advice. And then also I just encourage anybody to reach out to, obviously, any of the organizations that have sponsored this particular series, because this is where, you know, all the good teachers I know are getting up-to-date information, because a lot of stuff they're getting as far as anti-racism is concerned and things of that nature, it's old. And they think, you know, oh, it was published in 2014, it's new. It's not. So those are my two big pieces of advice. I see the time, so I'll mute myself.
Okay, thank you so much, Allison. I really appreciate and then giving us that sense of like just the bigger picture there in which this work is done. Dora, we're gonna get to hear from the students now, so I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Okay, it is my distinct honor to welcome Joyce and Jaime, who are students at Farmington High School and East Lyme High School, respectively. Joyce and Jaime, can you just start by talking about how the curriculum and education you received addressed Asian American history and contemporary Asian American issues, what was missing, and what more do you feel like needs to be done?
All right, so I think that, I think that the impression that I always got from, I don't know, my camera won't work, that's so weird. All right, never mind. I think the impression that I always got from like the teaching of Asian American history in like our schools is that Asian American history has always been like tangential to like the main narrative of like US history, right? Sorry about the camera, like it just crashed or something, I don't know. But for example, like we talked about the Transcontinental Railroad, like we discussed it in the context of like modernization during the 1860s, and the treatment of Chinese workers was like sort of like a side note and like was never like a center narrative in that discussion, even though it was as an Asian American myself, as someone like who would want to like learn about that history, learn about like the conditions that people were facing during that time, that wasn't really like seen as like the point of that lesson, right? And then we would talk about like Yale apparel and the attitudes towards Asian Americans at the time, but you know, we leave out events such as the Chinese massacre of 1871, where like 10% of Chinese population in San Francisco was murdered. And we get to like Japanese internment. Like I remember, this isn't my personal story, but one of the students in our school's Asian American Student Union, she was telling me that, you know, like when they were learning about World War II back in like 6th grade, she asked her teacher, like, you know, like what happened with the Japanese during this time? And then the teacher told her that it wasn't important and that it wasn't like something that they were going to cover during that like their unit. And like, to be like fair to the school system, like it does get better the higher up and the educational levels you go, because like you do get into like more detail, more into like the nuances of what happened. But I think even when I took AP US history last year, when we talked about Japanese internment, we did, you know, like in isolation, we focused on like, you know, like it was racial discrimination, it was like completely unjustified. But then we zoom out and we get to, and then it ends up being tied into like, rather than like the human rights violations of Japanese Americans during that time, it gets tied into like FDR's legacy and like looking at like the broader scope of, you know, like although FDR deprived like 100,000 Japanese Americans of human rights and liberties, we still consider him a good president because of his actions during like that time. And I think that it's sort of, we sort of like gloss over the impact of that. And I really can't imagine that we would be like having the same narrative if it were like white Americans, if it were like Italian Americans or German Americans who had been interned during that time. So, you know, like that's something that really stuck out to me during my history like curriculums in the past few years. And then last thing I want to talk about is something that has been completely left out of the narrative of Asian American history is Asian American involvement in like the civil rights movement and in activism in the 1960s. And we did not discuss any Asian American activists, any Asian American movements during that time, I learned about people such as Yuri Kochiyama and like Grace Lee Boggs and the Asian American Political Alliance at UC Berkeley. All these things I learned like through my own research, through like my own like involvement in like trying to like educate myself about these issues. And you know, we don't learn about tragedies such as like the murder of Vincent Chin and how that led to like a really like mobilization of Asian American activism during that time too. And I think that leaving these narratives out, it really leaves Asian Americans today just very confused and very lost about like what their place in America is, because, you know, if we don't know, like, you know, like how did we advocate for ourselves in the past? How did we empower ourselves? How did we like take part in these activist movements in the past? You know, like how we can't use that to like inform our experiences today. And, you know, it's become like, I mean, like, it's always been necessary, but like, you know, like very recently with the rise in hate crimes, it's been like more on people's minds. It's been like more at the forefront of the conversation. And I think that if we had a stronger education surrounding Asian American history and surrounding all of like the previous incidents that I've talked about, it would leave us more aware, leave us more educated about where to go from this moment and where to like shape our future too. So, you know, that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Joyce just said. When the learning I received in my high school social studies curriculum, I think only scratched the surface of Asian American history. Like we talk about Chinese exclusion, and then Japanese internment and like Korean and Vietnam War. But I feel like that this current social studies curriculum only focuses on the Asian immigration story and doesn't really focus on how the Asian American community and culture was formed in the United States. I think the learning I received so far doesn't really get a complete picture of history, meaning it's only really taught from the American perspective. Like this year I took AP US history, and I was not really exposed to as many different points of view as I would have expected. And I'm comparing that to a course I'm taking next year, which is AP World. And I've talked to a few students who have taken that class of like, if we talk about other perspectives, like besides the American perspective, and most of them have said that like it goes out of the American perspective, but it is mostly Eurocentric. And so it kind of makes Asian students feel that like the term like world relates to only the European continent, and it doesn't, and like all historical events revolve around Europe and doesn't really include other countries. So another thing, something that was missing from history that I feel like is important. It's not really like a wide broad topic. It's kind of just like a specific historical event, but I'm the news editor in my school newspaper, and I was recently researching and writing an opinion piece about how Asian women are sexualized in American society. And through my research, I found the Page Act of 1875, which preceded the Chinese Exclusion Act and systematically prevented Chinese women from immigrating to the US under the pretense that they're prostitutes. And Chinese women were seen as a threat to the institution of marriage and a danger to white males because we were stigmatized as being unclean and spreading venereal diseases. And our reproductive rights were also criminalized based on the fear of populating the US with subhuman children or polluting white purity. And I was really shocked to learn about this, not only like from research, but that it was never taught to me in my history classes. I was like talking to like my family the other day about this, and like both my sisters went, I don't know what that is. Like I've never learned about that. And obviously that is a problem because you feel like your culture and your history is completely ignored. And there's so much deep history and culture within Asian countries, but most of it becomes erased and forgotten. In addition to that, Connecticut added a new class, the Latinx history course. But when I first heard about that and it was like brought to my attention, I was confused as to why Asian American history was not part of that course when there is the very big population of Asian students in Connecticut, which that further shows that Asian Americans are greatly excluded from history curriculums. And I think it's important that Connecticut implemented the Latinx course, but it's also important to include other races that are underrepresented as well. So, I mean, I think that something that teachers can do to like help with this is to talk more about like these controversial issues in classrooms. But I know that the problem with that is some teachers say that they can't talk about like these controversial or political issues because sometimes the district limits what the teachers can say. And a lot of my teachers that I talked to about this said that they don't want to lose, they haven't, like they can lose their jobs if they say something that is controversial. And I understand like that point of view, and there's obviously like many sides like to the issue of not teaching students about racism and talking about current events that center around racism. But the biggest advice I have about that is Asian students want to be treated the same as everyone else. And because we're seen as kind of like exotic and and we think, and people kind of stigmatize us like based on the model minority myth, especially like in my math class. Like I've been afraid to ask for help because my teachers just automatically assume that I have to be good at math, or like they're saying like, oh, you should already know this, and like I don't get treated the same way as my counterparts do. So like I think teachers should recognize that Asians are not the model minority. Although there are educated Asians and Asian Americans, there are some groups like refugees and immigrants who come from other countries to the US with no prior education, and they left their home country for a better future. But that doesn't apply to like all Asian Americans. And often the Asian American mental health is ignored because the model minority makes us out as like hardworking and obedient, even though it's a myth and it's used against other minorities in the country. Another thing I would add is we all have very different cultural characteristics, and we always want our teachers to familiarize themselves with the values, traditions, and customs of our various cultures. So maybe even like learning a few words of like our language, or like just like trying to like continuously do research and like educate themselves on our culture can set like a better tone from communication, because it shows like a better interest from teachers. Yeah, so that was the advice I had for teachers, and why I feel like what more needs to be done for the Asian American perspective.
Great. Joyce and Jaime, thank you so much for covering all of that ground, and also for like demonstrating all the work you've done to think about how Asian American studies could actually be, you know, foregrounded in the curriculum. We know you've also done a lot of organizing work in your respective schools, so I hope we can come back to it. But I want to now, we have some fantastic questions, and I want to turn to our colleague, Natalia Berginski, who's a teacher in New Haven on the steering committee for the Anti-Racist Teaching and Learning Collective. Bring everyone on the panel back, and then Natalia help you, invite you to field some of these questions to the panelists.
Yes, we've got some great questions here. I want to start off with a question. The curriculum and the legislative mandate for the new Asian American history course has come up a few times. And sorry, I think I need to be added here. Okay. I'm not sure if you can see me, but I can see you all, so it's great. So I had a question around, there I am. Yeah, curriculum coming from, legislative mandates, right? Versus coming from the community or some combination of that. And I wondered, I thought maybe several of you would want to speak to that, the sort of, the pros and cons and tensions that exist with those processes.
Yeah, I can jump in quickly, and I would really love to have other folks, weigh in too. So the way the bill is structured right now, it is a model curriculum that the State Department of Ed would have 2 years to develop, and so there wouldn't be a mandate for it. And I think that what that does is it generates one, a template, a basis for developing conversations and materials and pulling these things together for K through 8. And this isn't gonna, it's not the way the legislation is structured is it doesn't have a high school studies component, which doesn't mean that it can't be there, but just that the legislative thrust of this bill is to generate a model curriculum for K through 8. And I think that's a really exciting development, because it is grade level specific for not only Asian American studies, Pacific Islander, Native studies, right? So these are ways that we can contribute to the state's curriculum development. But then also, it's not because it's not a mandate. It doesn't mean that that is the specific curriculum that school has to adopt. And like I showed with the map of Connecticut, there's a really broad range of diversity, and not even within a county, the districts within a county are going to have a different composition too. And so I think being flexible and being engaged with the communities is really, the exciting part of having something on the table, is to then have communities meet that.
Thank you. Other folks who wanted to weigh in on this?
Yeah, sure, I would love to. So in Boston, today I'm in the capacity of a member of the Ethnic Studies Now Committee through the Boston Teachers Union. In the last 2 or 3 years, we've basically had a campaign, right, to get ethnic studies into Boston public schools. And in that campaign, we decided that right away that we weren't going to go the mandate route, because we knew a mandate would never save us, right? We knew a top-down mandate, any top-down anything would never save us, because even if we asked, Boston to mandate a graduation requirement, it was like, just having seen all the other curriculum that has been sort of pushed on teachers, we knew that wasn't going to work, right? And we knew that not only do we need to fight for the sustainable funding of ethnic studies within the district, but also at the same time build it, right? So we couldn't just spend all of our energies fighting it. We actually had to build the curriculum. We had to train teachers ourselves, because at the end of the day, like, we want ethnic studies in classrooms, right? And the way that we get that is through teachers, because we have access to teachers, right? And so if teachers have that kind of framework, it doesn't matter, honestly, if you have an ethnic studies labeled class, you have a title that says you teach ethnic studies, or because sometimes when you have a title like that, you're not actually teaching ethnic studies, right? We know how it goes, right? In K through 12 education, right? Especially 9 to 12 education. But like, also, if you have you're teaching ELA 12, like you teaching English 12th graders, you might actually be able to teach ethnic studies in it, right? So we knew that this was the way that we're going to get into the classrooms, is through this popular movement of folks to train people deeply, sort of not only in the content, it's not just content, right? Because people always think that, oh, ethnic studies and all that, that's just more content, more history, right? But it's not, right? It's the pedagogies, it's the way in which you teach it, right? That is central to teaching Asian American studies. And then it's the frameworks and the lenses that we look at the world through. And then it's the content, because the content can be happening right now, right? While we're speaking, and we need to be able to be flexible, and then also draw back history, right? So we often talk about sort of the curriculum being not only that you see each other in a contemporary way, right, with other people, and while they're telling their stories, but also in a historical way, this way too, right? So multi-dimensional, the way that you're seeing your story being told, and the way you see people resisting. And so basically we've in Boston decided that we wanted to build a popular movement of people to like do this, right? And then also to push the district to pay for it. And so we've won a few things. We won a position, right, for an ethnic studies coach and curriculum, ethnic studies coach and coordinator, and then some funding around paying teachers. And we're right now trying to create a plan moving forward, not asking the district to create a plan, but actually the teachers and the other community members that we built with to create a plan for 5 years moving forward of how to sustainably integrate ethnic studies into the curriculum. So that includes things like prep time, right? To actually collaborate. You can't just give people an extra stipend and expect them to do it on top of the work, their course load that they're already doing, right? So like there are sort of like very structural things that we're trying to put into moving ethnic studies forward in Boston.
Yes, love all that. Thank you so much. Really a model that we can all learn from and build alongside you. I've got another question here about something that's also come up several times, resistance, right? And how and why it's so important to center resistance in teaching Asian American history, and also what it looks like to teach that, as Professor Lowe, you mentioned early on, alongside, stories of resistance, of Indigenous resistance, Black resistance, Latinx resistance.
Definitely. I mean, I can just add a little bit. I think it's, as Katie's already said, so often we receive the history of Asian Americans as a supplement to the main history of the US national narrative. And it's so important to tell the histories of how people struggled to contest those formations, and how they struggled with one another. So I think, especially like the workers' struggles during the times of earlier periods is really important, but also especially during the 1960s and 70s.
All right, and I know we're short on time and we want to hear from the students, from Joyce and Jaime. So a question that I personally am really interested in hearing about is, we heard a lot of examples of, domination and violence, of racism and oppression, and it's so critical to teach those histories. And I think Professor Chang, you mentioned earlier, and I'm curious the students' thoughts on how, it's also important to hear about, joy, celebration, and beauty in Asian American history and Asian studies, Asian American studies. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that, just in your experience in the classroom, having both of those elements.
Yeah, I want to turn it over to Joyce and Jaime, but one of the things that I've done with, by incorporating visual arts is asking students to look at other artists' work, and then take their learning from my history class, and then what we do is we look at archival maps and other archival materials, and I ask them to make copies and collages, but to make aesthetic choices that reflect their learning in the class, right? And what comes out of that is a number of fantastic images, which which students are generating their own meaning, right? And they're generating their own kind of like common sense about what Asian American studies is to them, and this just such beautiful kind of reflection of the learning, but then also all the many ways that people can be Asian American. But I know Joyce and Jaime have done some work at their schools too. I don't know if you want to share that.
Yeah, I think the celebration and like taking pride in our Asian American identity is definitely super important, especially in terms of like empowering students and like their own voices. So something that we've done in our school, which isn't like strictly tied to the curriculum, because it wasn't something we did like for a class, but our school, we have a group called the Asian American Student Union. It's this wonderful community of Asian American students at our school that have been working together and like having discussions about these issues all year, and it's like such a wonderful community to be part of. I absolutely love like every single person in there, and yeah. So something we did for Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, which was May this year, we put together a series of presentations, like educational presentations that we shared with our whole school community. during our whole school community during like one of our homeroom periods. So like we had a presentation on Asian cultures, Asian identity, and then the third one is about Asian history and activism. So it was really just a series of, helping Asian Americans celebrate their identities, which was like, the culture and identity presentation, like navigating like all the complexities of like factors that influence our identity, such as like the model minority myth, perpetual foreignerhood, like all those tensions. And then, like we made the last one activism because we wanted to learn about like how do we empower Asian Americans and how do we, like make sure that people who want to be allies are like have the tools and have the knowledge necessary to like truly support us. And so like that was a really good experience that I really think helped inform and educate a lot of our school community, non-Asian and Asian American alike. And I, like my whole hope for that was that, for like students to be able to come away from it saying, like I understand myself better, I understand like the AAPI community better. And, I think we like really sort of achieved that there. And then something else in terms of celebrating Asian achievement, we had a panel which included Dr. Jason Chang and Mr. Ring, who's also on this call. He's our former AASU advisor, and we had a wonderful conversation about, experiences being Asian American, like today, how it impacts like your personal experiences, your professional experiences, like advice that they would give to like young Asian American students today. I think it's being aired like next week or the week after that at our school. I don't think I can like share it like outside of like our Farmington Public Schools like community just because like security purposes, but yeah, I know, but it was also an incredible conversation that I think would be incredibly impactful for our students. And then last thing I want to talk about is that, yesterday we invited the Attorney General of Connecticut to visit our school, and honestly, one of the most incredible experiences that I've ever had. He came and talked about like, his like personal history, his experiences, like running as an Asian American Attorney General, like advice that he had, and then, like where he wants to like see like Asian Americans and kind of go next. And it was a really incredible conversation. And I think that, seeing that sort of representation of Asian Americans in these fields, in positions such as like, he's like the first Asian American to be elected on a statewide level in Connecticut, like seeing Asian Americans represented in those positions is also incredibly empowering to Asian Americans and students. And we got a lot of feedback from like Asian American students who were tuning in, who were like watching him present like in person, saying like, this is like, like this like seeing him and like seeing like all the wisdom, like advice he has to give was really like a great experience, and really like helped me like explore a lot of these aspects of like identity and what it means to be Asian American, that it's like difficult to unpack, right? But then he really like helped us on like that sort of journey. So yeah, a lot of stuff's been going on in Farmington High School during the month of May.
So much amazing student leadership, Joyce. Thank you for sharing all that. We want to turn it over to Jaime for just a last word.
Yeah, so
before our closing, sorry.
I've been working with my school librarian and a few other Asian American students in my school. And one of the things we're doing for Asian American Pacific Islander Month is we're writing the word harmony like all over the school, like in our foreign language. So we have that written right now in Chinese, Indian, Korean, and we hope to expand that in the upcoming weeks. I'm also, I mentioned this before, but I'm in the school newspaper, and this was the first edition that just came out for May. And this was the front page, and everyone, it was a great edition. Everyone like really complimented it. I wrote 2 articles like in this edition, talking about how to celebrate Asian American Pacific Islander Month, and like what people in our community can do to support. And then I also included some quotes from a few students about experiences racism they had, to try to get and trying to get like other students to read and learn from these perspectives. I'm also working with my school's Equity and Inclusion Committee, and I'm currently making a lesson that's going to be taught next Wednesday. That will be about they'll be learning about like racism, microaggressions, and how counterparts can learn from these experiences from the perspective of a minority, and how we can implement the Asian American history of Asian Americans into American history. So those are the things that I've been doing in my school.
Thank you so much, Jaime and Joyce and all the panelists. I'm passing it back to you, Professor Ho-Sang and Dora.
Great, thanks. We're at time. So grateful for everyone. Professor Chang, I want to turn over to you just to plug the event quickly next week. Then we'll thank everyone and head on our way. Jason.
Yeah, wow, guys. I thank you everyone for this amazing conversation. I'm always learning from y'all, and so excited to see this forum. And picking up on what Allison and Katie were pointing out about the process moving forward, we really wanted to create this space for community conversation, to bring in people from Board of Ed, teachers, that are parents, and bring them all together in the same conversation, and to model that for other communities too, to say like, this is something that can happen in your community. We're going to develop a discussion guide, and it's going to happen next week, Wednesday at 7 p.m. All right, here's the Zoom registration link. And then I also just want to add that if you want to follow along with our campaign for this bill, and other kinds of related events, including the Pacific Islander event, and then also a screening of Far East Deep South, which is a great documentary about Chinese in the Mississippi Delta. You can follow our Facebook page. It's Make Us Visible CT, and I left the link there too. I'll keep it short. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
Jason, for plugging those events. And just in final thanks too, with Professor Ho-Sang, to all our panelists, the professors, teachers, teacher educators, labor union members, and the students for really showing that there are so many points of entry to Asian American studies. Professor Ho-Sang.
Great. Thanks everyone for all the time. Thanks all the panelists. Fantastic. This is the fourth of our series. We're gonna send you off with a little Joe Batan, great Filipino R&B singer based in New York. Thanks everyone. Recording will be online in a couple of days. Grateful to you. Good night, everybody.